Qinduo Xu, obviously we talked about El Salvador, we talked about Washington. What about cross-straits relations? Because obviously this does have an effect between Taipei and Beijing.
Well, the case of El Salvador is between, the mainland and Taiwan here. We know this competition of diplomacy for the recognition is mostly about the one thing they call it like a 1992 consensus. The consensus is about one China. Both Taiwan and the mainland agrees there's one China, but it's open to interpretation. So this is one China in concept includes both the mainland and Taiwan. So Taiwan can explain in its own way, and the mainland can explain in its own way. So this allows some flexibility for both sides to coexist peacefully. That's what happened in the last administration before 2016. But since 2016, when the current Taiwan administration came into power, so they refused to acknowledge there's one China. So that's why you see there's a pressure from Beijing, basically by establishing more relationship with more countries here. But let me respond a little bit about this the notion of a military base in the Liaoning port over there. I think it is a bit far-fetched. For China, if you look at China's activity in Central America, in Latin America, in general here in the backyard of the United States, let's say, China respects the U.S. political influence, respects the U.S. tradition here. So China's activity is purely economic, about trade, about investment. China won't, I think China may have a military presence in Africa, but Central America, Latin America, in terms of importance, is no match for Africa to China, no.
Nicolas, is that something you agree with, that it's purely economic from Beijing and not tied, for example, to previous experiences of Washington's political interference in the region?
Yes, with the countries, that has historical diplomatic relations with Beijing, this is, I agree with my colleague what just said, that is mostly about foreign aid and trade relations. But this new trend that we see of this switch, as we can see Panama and the Dominican Republic, we have to see if this is the same kind of situation we're going to have, because we have to remember that the U.S. and China is in the middle of a very important trade dispute. So the kind of dynamics that we see are not necessarily only about economic and trade. Probably we see another dynamics more related with politics. And coming from China, we all know that these kind of things, the politics side of the relations, are the more quiet and silent part. So it's not something that is most explicit in this relationship. So it's difficult to see and to clearly identify these kind of things. But I'm sure that China is interested in Central America for more than just in an economic and trade relation.
Remi, your thoughts? Obviously, that point well taken about the growing trade war, the need to source soybeans and other foodstuffs. Is that part of what's going on here?
Well, I agree that it's mainly economical issues of infrastructure as part of the One Belt, One Road policy out of Beijing. And my point about the potential, military development, which is a very far-fetched, I agree, idea. But the idea is that maybe explains the reaction from John Bolton and from the White House. That reaction actually was not existent when it came to Panama and Dominican Republic. And actually, the silence of the White House was very much telling at the time. We're looking at a region that traditionally has been the backyard of the U.S. We come back to the Monroe Doctrine, that the idea of the Latin America is actually but is actually part of the sphere of influence of the United States, and we moved away from this because the Trump administration has taken so many steps backwards in terms of influence over the region, but also in the Pacific Ocean. That started with the move away from the TPP, that was the Obama policy in trade towards countries in the Pacific region to try to limit or contain the rise of influence of the Chinese over the Pacific, and now this rise of influence is coming to Central America and Latin America. Now there's also an interesting point in terms of timing, which is soon Taiwan is going to be having local elections, and the situation of President Tsai right now is kind of complicated facing the opposition right now in Taiwan, and the decision from China to continue this domino falls of diplomatic ties with countries recognizing China is actually a major blow for the leadership in Taiwan, and potentially a rise of the opposition, which is much more amenable to Beijing. So there's a series of different interests here at play. The fact that Tsai also went to Paraguay, went to Belize recently, is trying to contain this evolution. There's a series of elements both infrastructure, economic, political, military, all those dimensions are at play right here. In terms of Salvador specifically, the objective is to create jobs, create wealth, and that will only come through the development of trade relationship with China, not only infrastructure, and not obviously political and military is not that important for Salvador itself.
Remi, lots to unpack there. I'm glad you, this first mention on the show of Monroe Doctrine, I think, which is quite incredible. But also you mentioned TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Benjamin, El Salvador, very dense country, 6.5 million people, but quite small, Pacific-facing. TPP obviously reorients a lot of these countries away from looking north to looking west out to the Pacific. It has free trade agreements with, I think, 41 countries. Is this what we're looking at, a sort of different mindset and viewpoint from Latin American countries generally?
I think potentially you see that. I think you see that more marked in South America. I think Central America remains highly dependent on the United States. It's linked culturally, it's linked through migration, it's linked through the CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement with the United States.
And there's NAFTA with Mexico.
And NAFTA with Mexico, that one obviously has greater uncertainty. I think the ties actually between the United States economically and culturally with El Salvador are quite strong. And I don't think the ties between El Salvador and Beijing are really the correct metric. I think it's this broader game that I referenced earlier with China in the region when it comes to economic development, when it comes to infrastructure finance, and when it comes to direct bilateral relationships between these countries and the authorities in Beijing. So I think that's another reason why it was odd for the U.S. government to take such a strong and strident stance on this particular decision by El Salvador. Number one, given the quiet acknowledgement that this is inevitable in the region, and number two, that I think there's a much broader issue, which again, I think relates to some defensible concerns in Washington about the Chinese role in Latin America. But I don't think that will be fought on the grounds of relationships with Taiwan and the region.
Yeah, the government in El Salvador seemed to be very sort of open about this struggle that they had to make this decision. The US is quite popular in El Salvador. Over 50% of the population seem to have positive views of the US. Is it because the government is slightly more left that they decided to go this way? What do you think?
I think it's a combination. This is a government that faces an election in February and not great prospects. I think it wants an infusion of assistance, and likely that would be the upside for El Salvador. I don't think you'll see a great gain in trade with China. If anything, it would be the trade in the other direction of greater Chinese imports through investments in a Salvadoran port. El Salvador's exports of coffee or fruit, I don't think at this point will be particularly attractive to the Chinese market. I think what they may get or hope to get is an infusion of infrastructure finance. And that's something that the government would have to show for its administration and help it in the subsequent election. I think that's probably the best it can hope for in the short term. The United States does remain popular in that region and is heavily invested in terms of security assistance. U.S. soft power is eroding in Latin America, and the popularity of the United States has diminished in an extraordinary way very rapidly in the Trump administration. But the ties, again, in Central America are very strong and consistent.
Nicolas, the politics of the region, we have a sort of leftist government up for re-election in El Salvador. There seems to be a push right and left constantly in Latin America. How does that play into Washington's view of the region and also Beijing's opportunities?
Yes, I think right now Washington in general about the region, I agree what has been saying in terms of when we think about Latin America, of what the White House is saying is basically it's about migration and problem with Central America. What we have the rest of Latin America, the South America is basically, of course, we have many left-wing countries and left-wing parties, but we have another, Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, that are living another kind of dynamic. So I don't think the electoral and specifically ideological issue is a big part of the story here. But it's more like what the Trump administration is seeing about Latin America. That is a region that starts and finishes in Mexico, But we have another part of the region that is very important, and I think should be strategic to have more in strong relation with the U.S. and to don't have this kind of dynamics that we are seeing right now of hegemonic, and disputes in the region. Another point that is very relevant is that the economic integration in Latin America is very disorganized. We have 33 international agreements in the region, but all of them are not connected, are not coordinated. This is very difficult to have a clear view, of what the country of South America, for example, are looking for in terms of the relationship with China or the U.S. It's another factor that we have to consider in this analysis,
Remi, how do you think this sort of plays out for the politics in the region? Obviously, Venezuela is a big story, and this diplomatic move in El Salvador. How do you see the regional picture?
I mean, even without looking at specific Venezuela, although we can talk about this later, and what's interesting, the last point was essential, is the fact that there's a lack of original integration in Central America and beyond. Right now, each individual country is negotiating with China, developing their own infrastructure, but the objective for Central America would be truly in benefits of the population of Central America, would be to have some kind of a regional integration of infrastructure. There's no point in having La Union port in Salvador competing against the port of Balboa or Cristobal in Panama and other ports along the Pacific Ocean. What would be more interesting might be more a highway throughout, the Central American countries, or a kind of a cohesion of finding what is a comprehensive plan towards more development and more sustainable development in the region. We have here different political agendas because the countries in Central America have different majorities, but there is a community of interest here. What the region of Latin America has failed to do towards the United States in the last decades, which is trying to have a coherent voice rather than to negotiate individually with the United States the individual trade agreement, might actually serve as a lesson towards the future and trying to find some kind of cohesion to have an agreement, maybe through CELAC, maybe through other international organizations, with China or in the near future.
Qinduo Xu, I feel Belt and Road needs to be brought up here, the talk about infrastructure, tying regions together. This is very much on China's radar when it comes to Latin America, correct?
That's true. Even the representative from El Salvador, they talked about signing up to the Belt and Road Initiative, and China is in the good position to do construction of infrastructure, to finance infrastructure. So I think countries like El Salvador, this would be a wise decision to choose China as a partner. But look, I mean, choosing China as a partner is not done at the expense of the U.S. interests. El Salvador, their import and export with the United States, like 60% or to 70% of them is being done with the United States. So their relationship with the United States is strong. I think China is very clear of that. I think this region is not getting closer to China. They are simply establishing a normal country-to-country relationship with China. So I don't think the fear or the concern from Washington is well-founded. But look, if you look at the Asian situation, Asia-Pacific situation, look at Singapore. Can China say Singapore should not establish a relationship with the United States? That would be absurd, right?
A good point. I want to finish, though, with Benjamin. If you were in the White House still advising, how does the U.S. get back in the game a little bit with Latin America?
Yeah, I think the attractiveness of the Chinese market for trade is such that there's no dissuading countries in the region, nor should it be attempted from trading with China. This is particularly attractive for the commodity exporters in South America, those selling soy and selling copper to China. Those countries are going to seek access to that market increasingly. Right. When they obtain it, there's going to be benefits. I think where the U.S. can compete is in infrastructure and private sector finance. I think U.S. companies can credibly make the claim that they have advantages in terms of transparency, in terms of respect for labor codes, environmental concerns. I think that is still a compelling argument, but the government needs to be involved. There needs to be export credits. There needs to be good relations. There needs to be continued U.S. soft power. There needs to be engagement. I think the U.S. still has the advantage of shared values and shared history and shared peoples. It is sacrificing those advantages rapidly, unfortunately.
Well, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks so much for your insights here in the studio, also in Beijing, Los Angeles, Miami. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King. Thanks so much for joining us.